So good morning all. I'd like to welcome you very much to this Asian Development Bank Environmental Law Champions Train the Trainers lecture series. And this is the second in a series of lectures that will last over the next 5 months, every third Saturday, where we invite a distinguished environmental law academic and lecturer to present on a particular topic. The first one was 3 weeks ago with Professor Ben Bohr at the beginning of the launch of a Myanmar environmental law curriculum development program. Due to the events in Myanmar on the 1st of February, the Asian Development Bank has had to suspend the development of that Myanmar environmental law curriculum. But we decided that it was very important to keep the lecture series alive so that we could focus very strongly on the environmental rule of law, which is always under threat and always being challenged. As I said, today we have Dr. Jonathan Liljeblad to talk to us for 30 minutes, and then we will have some questions. And his topic will be on human rights and the environment. But before we do that, I'd just like to introduce the Asian Development Bank Train the Teachers Environmental Law Champions project. It's been going for a number of years, and during that time it has presented a number of Train the Trainers workshops. Prior to COVID, these were done in person with a number of participants from the region, held in Cebu in the Philippines, Naypyidaw, Yangon. They were held in Cambodia, which was a joint program between Cambodia and Laos, in Chiang Mai, which was a Thai program, in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and last November we held an Train the Trainers in India, which was attended by over 40 academics and junior academics to learn about training and teaching methodology and pedagogy. And we brought together representatives both from India and outside of India to talk about environmental law topics, environmental law teaching, environmental law pedagogy. And I also would like to mention that we do have Professor Amanda Kennedy speaking on Tuesday as part of our e-learning program. The e-learning program, if you go to teachenvironmentallaw.asia, there will be details for registration for that Tuesday talk, where Professor Kennedy will be talking about a series of modules that have been developed on key principles of environmental law and how that can be modified and taught in environmental law classrooms. Over the last few years, the Train the Teachers program has dealt with 11 countries and over 102 academic institutions and reached over 136 academic environmental lawyers. And that's a program that will continue this year. And we will be developing projects and train the teachers mostly in a virtual setting. So please, if you're interested, please make contact through the teachenvironmentallaw.asia website. Before we start with Dr. Jonathan, I would like to ask Angelo to play a short video that outlines the role of the Environmental Law Champions TTT program. So Angelo, if you are able to start the video, that would be great.
When I first heard about the TOT program, I was a bit skeptical because I thought that I'm teaching for nearly 2 decades. What else they are going to teach me? But after coming here, I'm really surprised that there are so many things to know and to learn and to adopt for myself.
I'm happy to report that, ever since I came back from the TTT in Manila, the number of students has increased. The first set of students which I taught in 2015 after I came back was 4 students. And the next semester, the registration went up to 30 students. That was the maximum limit. And ever since then, it was holding steady between 25 to 30. And the students themselves came back to me and said that this is the first elective subject that they have enjoyed.
I mean, the great value that I've seen of this TTT program is really the networking. They've now developed networks which have been fantastic, and they've been exposed to other environmental law professors within their region, and they're doing amazing things.
What is surprising to me, it is that after the TTT, several of our professors started another group. That is not for the environmental teachers alone, but also for the Environmental Protection Agency, the local people who really go to the polluters to find. I never realized there were so many practical questions that has to be answered. And what chemicals is toxic, why it is toxic, what's the legal basis, how much I should fine. That's also not only benefit those officials, but also benefit the teachers, because that's the real things, the real world. It's amazing. And I think the group is growing.
By focusing on training the trainers, we create the infrastructure to ensure that this growing demand for environmental law knowledge is going to be satisfied. I think this has been probably the biggest success that the Academy has had to date, because they've succeeded in mobilizing professors from all over Asia at a time when there's such a huge demand for improving environmental law, and yet nearly all these universities lack the capacity to be able to teach environmental law because they didn't have people who had the specialized knowledge that the environmental law field requires.
After this ADB TTT program, I told my students, go to an affected area, meet the stakeholders, find out why exactly is this problem. For example, there was a lake nearby which was being encroached by a lot of illegal occupants. So two guys went there and met the residents. They went to the elected representatives of the municipal bodies. They went to the government officials who are responsible for protecting the natural resources. So the moment when they reached the government officials, they got a point that these students are really going to make it a big issue, and therefore the government immediately acted upon this issue, and they cleared all the encroachments and they built a wall around the lake to protect it permanently. I think this is a small victory as a teacher that I could inspire my students to do such a thing. The change should start from each and every one of us.
Look, it's been inspirational, frankly. I've found myself totally inspired by the commitment, the enthusiasm and the capacity of the people that we've been very fortunate to locate. So we're actually building a bottom-up resource now of environmental law teachers, and to which we're adding all the new people that are coming in through the training, mixing with the more older experienced teachers in their own country, and building a whole base there to carry this work on well into the future, which I think is one of the most exciting things of all, to see that this project has a lifetime, a longevity and a sustainability beyond the actual training.
So, Jonathan, can I please give you the floor for your talk on human rights and the environment?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Matthew, and I hope everyone can hear me. So what I have today is, I just want to, before I start, I'll show you a website for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Environment. And then I will go directly to the PowerPoint. But first, just to let everyone know, there's been a lot of work done on human rights and the environment at an international level. So currently, if you look at your screen, you should see the website for the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. This can be found on the page for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And both Matthew and I know the Special Rapporteur. The current Rapporteur is David Boyd, so you see his photo there at the bottom of the screen. Before David Boyd, there was John Knox, and John Knox is currently in the United States, returned to the United States. But both Matthew and I have met John Knox and David Boyd, and both of them have done work under the United Nations to go around the world to work with scholars and practitioners. So this means academics like yourselves, as well as lawyers, judges, government representatives, policymakers, international institutions, to try and synthesize or to create principles about human rights in the environment, to discuss empirical work. So this is data that is collected from different case studies in different countries around the world. And then also to develop both theory, so theory that helps people understand the basis or the legal foundation and the philosophical foundation for human rights in the environment. But then in addition to that, also provide guidelines for practice by lawyers, as well as government policymakers and NGO policymakers. So I would strongly encourage all of you, as you go forward into the future, that you would take some time to go to this page. There's a link in my PowerPoint slide, and my understanding is that my PowerPoint can be shared with all of you after today. In addition, I'll have my email information in the PowerPoint so that you can reference what I'm doing and then send me questions or requests directly. So let me go now directly to the PowerPoint. And, oh yes, so Matthew is indicating that if you have questions, you are more than welcome to put your questions in the Q&A box. I'll answer them at the end of my presentation today. It will take a little time, but if your questions are in the Q&A box, then I can see them. And then at the end, I can go directly through the list of questions and provide responses. In addition, of course, after the presentation today, we're more than welcome to have a discussion directly. So to my PowerPoint. So on the screen, you should see my PowerPoint presentation. I won't go into detail for each of the slides, just simply because of the limited time that we have, which is, my understanding is 30 minutes. But I will provide to you the major points and highlight certain things that I think are very important. At the lower right, you will see my email addresses. So I'm affiliated with the Australian National University and the College of Law. And I give to you my email address at ANU, but I also give to you my Gmail address as a backup, just in case you're not able to reach me at my ANU email. So today, I'm assuming that most of you have had prior knowledge or understanding of international law, so I will not be discussing the foundational components of international law. I'm also assuming that you've had some background regarding human rights, at least you're aware of it, that you understand it. I'm also assuming you've had some prior introduction to environmental law. So at least you're aware of the cornerstone or foundational principles of international environmental law. With respect to human rights in the environment, historically, these are two different disciplines or subfields. And within law, there have been specialists who focus on human rights law and specialists who focus on environmental law. What is happening now, particularly since the 21st century, is that there's an increasing attempt at interdisciplinary connections. And so a reflection of this is the attempt to have greater connections between human rights and the environment. So the two subfields are now being connected to each other. And the reasoning is given here. So on the screen, you'll see that there are the definitions for human rights and the environment from the United Nations, from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So the United Nations, the position of the UN is that, that in order to enjoy human rights, you must be in a healthy environment, so that the environment provides ecosystem services. So ecosystem services means things like food, water, materials for clothing, materials for housing, also quality of life. So when we say that there are ecosystem services, we are recognizing that the environment provides materials to provide us a decent quality of life. so that we have to achieve ecosystem services in order for us to live. And once we have ecosystem services to live, then we can exercise or claim human rights. Also, however, the United Nations recognizes that that the environmental conservation or protection of the environment requires human action. That a lot of the damage, a lot of the changes that are happening in the environment now are the result of human activity. So therefore, we need human rights to allow humans to change their behavior, to defend their interests, particularly interests in a healthy environment. So this is where the United Nations says that you need to have human rights to allow environmental protection. This is similar to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So IUCN is an advisory body to UNESCO. And as you know, UNESCO is part of the United Nations system. So IUCN is very consistent with the rest of the UN. It says that human rights and environmental protection are interrelated, and they are both fundamental. So there's no priority of one over the other. They are both the same priority. And it says that, in addition, that environmental quality is necessary to enjoy legal rights. So this means that the legal system that protects legal rights requires that human beings be in a safe, sustainable, healthy environment. The other thing that the IUCN mentions is that the environmental conservation requires legal rights, that if we're going to have a legal system that provides or supports environmental conservation, this means we have a legal system that recognizes legal rights regarding the environment. Something that I want to remind everyone, for those of you who've had international law before, there's a term, rights-based approaches, or RBA. This is something you will hear quite often when we talk about human rights and when we talk about environmental rights. So RBA, or rights-based approaches, means that we are dealing with problems using the concept of rights, right? So, you know, that I have a right, you have a right, it's a right to a healthy environment, it's a right to life, it's a right to justice, these kinds of things. So that if we're using a legal system to solve problems including human rights problems, environmental conservation problems, then it means that we are employing a defense of legal rights. Now, just some basic things in terms of terminology regarding human rights, and this is to remind everyone, when we talk about rights and rights-based approaches, there's a difference between positive rights and legal rights. So positive rights is if you have a positive right, it means that you have the ability to ask other people to do something for you, right? In contrast, there's a negative right. So if you hold a negative right, that means that you have the ability to ask other people to stop their activities, to stop what they're doing, okay? So for example, you can say that a right to clean water can be a positive right. This means that you are requiring the government to provide you or give you clean water. But it can also be a negative right, because it means that you can ask the government to stop all pollution that threatens clean water. So when we talk about rights-based approaches, we're talking about positive and negative rights. The other thing that we should understand regarding law, or human rights law, environmental law, we have to be very careful. The idea and application of rights within a legal system is related to, but not the same. So it's connected to, but different from social rights and moral rights. So social rights are rights that are necessary for our society to function, our society to exist, to maintain stability, harmony, to allow people to live every day with some stability, predictability, safety. There are moral rights, so rights that tell us things are right and wrong. So for example, that we will say that it is morally wrong to kill someone. It is morally wrong to steal from someone. So this is an example of moral rights. Not all social rights, not all moral rights are expressed in law. So if, remember, if we are saying as lawyers, as environmental law scholars, that we want to have legal solutions to environmental problems, this means that we need to have legal rights. So in society, in the news media, in the government, they may have discussions about social rights or moral rights. But if you are a lawyer and you are trying to say that the legal system has to provide a solution to an environmental problem, then you have to remind everyone that you have to work with social rights and moral rights that are expressed in law, because the legal system can defend legal rights, right? So it can defend rights that are in the law. But if it's not in the law, then it becomes very difficult for the legal system to address it, right? So social rights can be legal rights, but not all the time. Moral rights can be legal rights, but not all the time. A second thing I need everyone to remember is that there's a vertical and horizontal understanding of rights. So when we talk about vertical human rights, we are saying that we are observing or monitoring the behavior of states in relation to people. And if we're talking about horizontal human rights, this means that we are observing the behavior of people to each other. So in the international human rights system, we recognize that treaties, human rights treaties, may relate to the behavior of states. It's, states are parties to human rights treaties. So the obligations in a human rights treaty is upon state parties. However, in the human rights system, international human rights system, we recognize that states have a duty to promote human rights between people. So as much as the international human rights system is based on treaties involving vertical obligations between states, parties, and people, the international human rights system also is expecting states to promote human rights between people or horizontal relationships. Oh, okay. All right. Now, the next slide, I have given to you a diagram. So the relationship between environment and human rights. So Angelo, this is where we're going to launch the poll. But the question I want to ask everyone is that if you are dealing with the environment on one side and human rights on the other, what is the correct order? So the first option is that a healthy environment is necessary to fulfill human rights. And then the second option is that human rights are necessary to facilitate environmental conservation. So under your screen, you should see a poll. I would ask that you please choose what you think is the correct answer. Okay, so I think the remaining people who have not voted are uncertain. So Angela, can you go ahead and end the polling and just show everyone the results? Yeah, so on your screen, you'll see that it looks like the majority of you think it's option one, that a healthy environment is necessary to allow fulfillment of human rights. And then a minority believe it's the other way around, that human rights are necessary to allow a healthy environment. Thanks for your responses, everyone. That was great. This is a question I normally give to my students. I intentionally left out the third option because I was trying to force a choice, but I think those of you who did not vote probably suspected the answer. And the correct answer is that it's a trick question. According to the United Nations, it's both. right? So both of these directions are correct, and both of them are involved in the association between human rights and the environment. And so I'd given you kind of a hint on the very first slide when I gave you the definition that was from the United Nations, and also the definition that was from the IUCN. So, all right, let's proceed. I'm trying to, okay. So what you see on your screen now is exactly what I mentioned. So this is coming directly from the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council received a report from the Special Rapporteur, and they used the report of the Special Rapporteur to issue guidance. So all of you can now recognize that there is international guidelines or framework principles that were issued in 2018 regarding the relationship between human rights and the environment. And at the very top, Principle 1, Principle 2. Those two principles reflect the two answers that you chose in the poll. So Principle 1 is that states are supposed to provide a healthy, sustainable, clean, safe environment to allow the fulfillment, respect, and protection of human rights. The other direction, though, is also true, that states are supposed to fulfill, protect, respect human rights to allow and ensure a clean, safe, healthy, sustainable environment. Right? So you see that within the framework principles, it's both relationships. Now, other things I want to point out to you regarding the relationship between human rights and the environment is that there are a substantive component and procedural component. So the substantive component is what we addressed in the previous slide, but the Special Rapporteur and the Human Rights Council also recognize that in many countries, it is very difficult for people to exercise their rights, right? That the legal system does not give people the ability to go to court and use legal procedures to defend their substantive rights. So the framework principles articulated procedural rights that are necessary to ensure the connection between human rights and environment. I won't go into all of these, but I just want to note some examples. So Principle 3, that you cannot have discrimination, that if you're going to allow the existence of a right to an environment, if you're going to allow people to say that they have that the right to life means that they need to be able to protect the environment around them, it cannot be inequality. Everyone should have the same rights to the same degree, and that there should be no discrimination in that. The other one I also want to note is Principle 5, that in order to be able to express your rights, to say that you have a right to life that relates to the environment, or to say that you have a right to the environment, you need the freedom to express your rights. You need the freedom to work with other people to communicate information about your rights. If necessary, you need to have the freedom to gather in groups so that you can defend your rights. So this is why we say that it's in order to have a connection between human rights and environment, that we have to allow or protect freedoms of expression, association, peaceful assembly. Principle 7 is also something else I want to note, is that information is very important, right? So that if people are going to be able to defend their rights, they have to know their rights. If people are going to defend human rights, they need to know what those human rights are. If people are going to try and defend the environment, they have to know what is the status or the condition of the environment. So this is where we say that that states need to protect the public's ability to get information. And it's not just that the information is available, but that it's accessible. So when we say that it's accessible, it means that the information is affordable, it's timely, and it's actually useful or effective, right? So I just want to highlight those. I won't mention any current events that are happening that involve these kinds of rights, but I will allow you and the audience to reflect on those in your individual context. In addition to the substantive and procedural rights, the framework principles also recognize general duties. And so one of the things I will note here, Principle 8, is that that before the government takes any kind of action, before the government starts a new development project, before a government issues a contract for a project, that it has to do an assessment of environmental and human rights that are affected by government action. Right? So in the United States, this is called the state action doctrine, that before there's a state action, there must be an assessment of the consequences of the state action. So in this case, we were asking for assessment of environmental and human rights impacts, or impacts on environment and human rights. So this will relate, I think, to some of your other discussions about environmental impact assessment. There is now a trend of something called a social impact assessment or societal impact assessment. So the environmental impact assessment relates to this principle, but there's also a social impact assessment that deals with this principle as well. The other one I'll mention here, I won't go, like I said, I won't go into all of these, but I will note Principle 15, that we recognize that there are indigenous communities or traditional communities that have, their cultures are very unique and they're vulnerable. And that in a number of countries that we say that these are not just individual rights, but these are community rights, group rights, that to protect the identity of indigenous peoples. So this is a new trend as well. And so when we think about human rights, it is not just human rights regarding individuals, it is also human rights regarding groups. Right? So I won't go into more detail, but I just want to show you this for future reference to help you think about this concept. Now, how do you find the sources of these rights? So on the previous page, everything that you see here in terms of our framework principles, these are guidelines, they're principles. However, they are not something that have the authority of law. So in international law, most of you, I think, will remember that there's a hierarchy or a rank order of authority, so that things like framework principles are useful, but they don't have the same kind of authority or power as, say, something like a treaty. So when we say that there are rights or human rights or environmental rights, remember that we are trying to think about them in terms of legal rights. So if we're talking about legal rights, then we have to find legal authorities that articulate them. So I won't go into all of this, everything here on the PowerPoint, but I give these to you as examples. It's to show you the kind of exercise that you will have to do if you choose to try and practice this kind of a concept. And what this reflects is a mapping, we call it a mapping exercise, that you will say in a given kind of a dispute that there is a problem regarding right to life, that for example, that the environment in Ifugao terraces in the Philippines is becoming polluted or becoming impacted by development, and that is preventing people or communities from being able to sustain themselves, and it is threatening their right to life. Well, if you're trying to exercise a right to life in that kind of a situation, you have to find the authority, the legal authority that expresses that. So this is a mapping exercise where you have to find the international treaty that articulates that, and then see how that treaty is implemented in your country. So what I've done here is I said, well, the right to life, it has been connected to a safe and healthy and sustainable environment. But the way you have to rationalize this, the logical argument, the logical reasoning you have to follow is that it's expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 3, so UDHR. But you will say that as a declaration, the UDHR is not binding. So if you want to find something that is binding, you can turn to the ICCPR, so the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 6. And then if you want to try to find that connection between the international treaty and domestic law, then you would have to find within your given country, how is that treaty implemented? So here, the example I give is that there was a communication regarding EHP versus Canada in 1990 that talked about the implementation of these international, the legal rights in these international treaties at a domestic level. And so what I've done here on the screen is I've done this for other rights that are quite common. These are the rights that are quite often used with respect to environmental conservation. So another example is the right to religion and culture. So this is something that is used quite often by indigenous communities, that you will say that your religion or your culture is based on or dependent upon particular environmental resources, particular trees, particular water sources. And so as a result, impacts on the environment can impact your religion, it can impact your culture. And so here I've mapped out the international cases that have made the connection between this particular human right to environmental conservation. So here it's Maya Indigenous Communities of Toledo District versus Belize. And this is from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So this is just an example of a mapping exercise that I think all of you would have to follow. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to continue to talk about Asia and Southeast Asia. I think most of you know that Asia poses a particular challenge. There is something that we quite often talk about is Asian values or the Asian way. And what happens quite often in Asian countries is that they say human rights are universal, but Asia is different. Or they'll say that international environmental law is universal, but Asia is different. So this is the challenge between what we say are universalist arguments or relativist arguments. So anytime you hear someone say that we go by the Asian way or we live by Asian values, that's telling you that they are using the relativist argument. Whereas the world, when it says that there's something called international law or international human rights that are universal, so they apply to everyone, then this is an example of a universalist kind of argument. The other challenge with Asia is we talk about the principle of non-interference. So we say in many Asian countries, they say we do not get involved in internal affairs of other countries, and that sovereigns have impunity, that sovereigns can do whatever they want inside their own borders. The response that has been provided to this, so this is coming from the European Court of Human Rights. They have articulated something called the margin of appreciation doctrine. So for those of you who speak French, that's margin d'appréciation. This principle or this doctrine says that true, countries are different, cultures are different, very true. We recognize that there is a tension between universalist versus relativist positions. However, and this is the ruling direct from the European Court of Human Rights in 1961. They said that, yes, we will have a balance between the interests of the community and fundamental human rights. So fundamental human rights in the European perspective means individual human rights. So they're saying that, yes, there's a balance between the community and individual, but that we are still going to give preference or give particular concern regarding fundamental human rights or individual human rights. So this is, yes, we recognize there's a balance. We recognize that there are differences across cultures, but we still are going to give some kind of emphasis or respect towards fundamental human rights. The other challenge, and this is specific to Southeast Asia, is that there's the issue of how states in Southeast Asia implement international treaties. So the things that you will have to be careful about. Number one, as international law scholars, you'll know that you have to always check what is the status of your country as a state party to a treaty. You'll also have to worry about what are the rules in your country regarding implementation of domestic implementation of international law. And then the third thing, which is probably the most critical, is that if we're talking about legal rights, Remember that only legal persons can claim legal rights. So this means that a person has to be recognized by the legal system as being able to exercise or claim rights. So this is something that varies across different countries in Southeast Asia. So for example, in some countries, they recognize the existence of indigenous rights, and they have voted in support of the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but they have not granted legal personality to indigenous communities in their borders. I will avoid mentioning of the specific countries that have followed this line of logic, but I'll leave this for you. Now, my response, or I think the response of many scholars, is that there's still a way to deal with this, that within ASEAN, even within the context of ASEAN, that there are institutions, legal sources that provide ways to connect human rights and the environment. And there are many non-state actors that are trying to advocate in support of human rights and the environment. So what this means is that we recognize that the condition of ASEAN now, with respect to human rights, with respect to environmental protection, we recognize that it's an ongoing project. So we use this term constructivist project, that it's a long-term project to try and get members of ASEAN to adjust, to respect human rights and the environment. And that it won't necessarily be purely through legal mechanisms, that as much as we work through the law, we will have to connect to social movements that combine contributions from NGOs, that combine institutions to try and influence a change in the legal systems to allow more connections between human rights and the environment. And we have to do it in a way that's smart. So it's not always about confrontation, but it's always also about cooperation, engagement, convincing our leaders to allow these kinds of changes to happen. It takes time. It's not always easy. And as you know, there are some countries right now where this is currently not feasible, but it is something that has happened in other parts of the world. And in many countries in Asia, you've seen that over the course of 40 years, 50 years, that there has been a greater respect for human rights and a greater respect for environmental conservation. All right. Now, since we're getting close to the end with about 5 minutes left, just very quickly, I want to raise something else that will affect you in terms of trying to connect human rights and environment. Be very careful about how we discuss or think about the environment. The reason is that you are a function of your education. And your education may have occurred at a time when our understanding of the environment was not very good. And the current understanding of the environment that exists now is very different from the understanding of the environment that existed in the 1960s and existed in the 1900s, existed in the 1800s. So specifically, what I point out to you here is that historically, in many countries, environmental conservation laws were based on this perception that nature is static, it does not change. And that when we are doing conservation, we are trying to make everything static. We want populations of animals to be fixed. We want the land to always stay the same. In reality, what we recognize now, according to modern science, is that the environment always changes, that there's something called ecological flux, that populations of trees and animals change, that the environment will change. The other thing that you will have to be careful about is that many environmental conservation laws are based on policies from the colonial era. And so under the colonial era, environmental conservation meant an isolation of nature from humans. So that anytime you had environmental conservation, it meant you were trying to remove people from the environment. In modern science, has increasingly recognized that this is not always true, that most places in the world have had some kind of human interaction. And as a result, that when we talk about environmental conservation, we have to think of the environment in relation to human activity. In other words, that nature was not always pristine, or it's not necessarily correct to think of the nature as being pristine. So in other words, empty of humans. And that we have to think about human activity as not always harmful, that there is a way to adjust human activity that in a way that's beneficial to the environment. So I give you a link here. This is very recent development. This is from Levis and other scholars, and they've done research in the Amazon, for example, and they found that the Amazon rainforest is actually a product of more than multiple millennia. I think more than 10,000 years of human cultivation. And the reason why people believe that the Amazon is pristine without humans is because European colonizers arrived to the Amazon after smallpox, bubonic plague, and other diseases had wiped out the Native Americans who had lived there. So that what we think of as the Amazon is not necessarily what is historically accurate. So this is based on archaeological research that is happening now. Now I'm going to finish with a case with the time we have left. And Matthew, hopefully you just give me a few extra minutes this will be really quick. So here it's a case with Yellowstone National Park. So Yellowstone National Park is the very first national park in the world. It was declared a national park in 1872. And for better or for worse, it became the model of national parks for the global community. So all of the national parks in the world are variations of Yellowstone National Park. And what happened with Yellowstone National Park, so you see here the picture of Yellowstone National Park. I think, hopefully you think that this is very pretty. It's very pristine, and it's the kind of thing that we want to conserve. But then I want to tell you that there's some background. So on the lower left-hand side, you'll see a picture of Yellowstone National Park in the late 1800s. And what is often forgotten is that Native Americans lived inside Yellowstone National Park. Specifically, it was the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Bannock, the Nez Perce peoples of this area. And what happened after 1872 was the United States government said, oh, this is a national park. We are doing environmental conservation. So all of the Native Americans have to leave. So in the 1870s, 1880s, the United States government began the process of removing all of the Native Americans from this land. And in fact, in 1879, sorry, the United States government built a fort inside to try and to maintain a military presence to keep Native Americans away. In addition, over time, the United States government said that this is a very good tourist attraction. So they started allowing tourists to come in. So here you see tourists at Old Faithful Geyser, Yellowstone National Park. And currently, Yellowstone National Park receives between 3 and 4 million visitors every year. So 3 and 4 million visitors. All of them are paying a fee to enter. So it's providing a lot of money for the US government. In recent years, they said that they want to do conservation. They want conservation to restore what they think existed in the park. So they, however, this is happening at the same time, they are trying to encourage tourism. So in the lower right-hand corner, you see that there are buffalo or bison, and that these have to coexist with the tourists and the rows that are there. And then at the upper right-hand corner, they said that they reintroduced species, the wolf, that had disappeared. Now, what I want to ask you, Angelo, this is the last poll or the second poll, is in this kind of a situation, who has rights? Do you think, do the tourists have rights? Do the Native Americans have rights? Do the wolves and the buffalo have rights? So let's see what your responses are. Okay, Angela, we're going to close the poll here in a few seconds. Let's close it at the 1:30 mark, and then you can show the results.
Okay.
Yeah.
The tourists aren't doing very well.
Poor tourists.
Don't bias the responses. Okay, so let's go ahead. Yeah, so let's go ahead and close the poll and show the results. All right, everyone, thanks for your responses. So on your screen, you'll see the results of the poll. And once again, I intentionally left out a fourth option because I was trying to force people to make a choice. It looks like most of you think the Native Americans have rights, and then the wolves and the buffalo second, and then the tourists third. The correct answer is that there is no correct answer. This is a point of controversy in current legal circles. The results or the inclinations are dependent upon the courts of the specific country that you go to and the rationale that's being exercised by the judges. Now, so for example, I think there was a question earlier about this idea of rights of the environment or rights of nature, these kinds of things. So this discourse or that idea is pretty well developed in places like New Zealand, Ecuador, and India. And so there is a greater tendency by those courts to think about the idea of rights of nature. So in this case, wolves and the buffalo. However, it differs in which country. So New Zealand says yes. The Supreme Court in India said maybe, but not yet. Other countries like the United States, Australia, they said that this is an interesting idea, but for the moment, we're not going to make it a legal doctrine. However, what is more developed is this idea of community rights to a healthy environment. So those of you who selected Native American, I think you're reflecting the logic or rationale of those jurisdictions, that they say that we recognize that there is a group of people that are being treated unfairly or inequality, and that their status is tied to the environment. Now, regarding the tourists, I added that in there. There is so in the United States, for example, we have this idea of proximity in some discussions, and I don't mean the courts. I'm talking about the academic community. This idea about the proximity of the rights, and so here this discussion is that even tourists have rights to a degree because you can rationalize, or the logic is that everyone has a right to a healthy environment and everyone has a right to quality of life, and so that they should be able to get access to it if they can. However, like I said, this is something that's still developing across multiple jurisdictions. So I'm going to stop the presentation there. I'm going to stop sharing of the screen, and then I'll go to the Q&A, sorry. And I'll start to look at the questions.
Thanks, Jonathan. Can I first of all thank you for an excellent presentation, and in particular, I'm looking at sort of some of my notes. You raised issues about colonialism and post-colonialism, the Anthropocene, the concept of the issues of wilderness or non-human intervention, but also that has a whole range of consequences in terms of how people interact with the idea of the environment and the right to the environment, and you've mentioned that. But can we first perhaps look at some of the questions, and we've got quite a few very good questions, but let's start with Sokampetcha's question. He talks about, from his observation, human rights and democratic values have been curtailed by governments in some countries for the sake of COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think human rights to good environment and sustainable benefits from natural resources are being downgraded? And perhaps that also links into how that might interact with perhaps some of the issues about the framework principles and whether they've actually been endorsed by countries.
Yeah. So that's a good question, actually. Given the timeliness of conditions, and there's a related discussion on this about the impact of COVID-19 and specifically the impact of public health measures for COVID-19 on human rights. And so again, this depends on the jurisdiction that you're in, depends on the doctrines that they follow. So in common law countries, I'm thinking particularly in the places where I'm familiar with, which is the United States and Australia, there's a balance that's always considered, that that they'll recognize that there are certain kinds of emergencies, natural disasters, states of emergency, that require state action, and it involves a certain level of access, timeliness, efficiency, et cetera, that require some curtailment of particular rights. So an example of this is that during riot situations, they'll say that, oh, we have to institute a curfew, we have to institute or increase police presence in order to ensure the current arguments that are happening in Australia right now is in order to ensure the safe delivery of vaccines without causing public disruption. We are going to request greater presence from the police or the military in terms of the vaccine rollout. So I think it's dependent upon the jurisdiction. I think it's dependent upon the inclination of the particular context as to what's happening between COVID-19 and then the rights, human rights, and also rights to the environment. By the way, I will make note, it doesn't have to be this way, right? That it is possible to have public health measures that deal with COVID-19 without destroying freedom of speech. It's not necessary.
Right. So can I follow on? And there's a question by Nang Noi Nui Nud about the non-intervention of Asia's culture and in using an example of ASEAN being an association representing not the will of the people, but more of a political security for executive authorities. And I guess just following on that question about natural disasters and climate change, that there's been a focus on the pandemic, but most of us recognise that climate change-induced disasters will become greater, certainly within ASEAN and the Asia Pacific. Is that also going to be used as a mechanism to curtail civil liberties, freedom of association, freedom of expression, those fundamental human rights, again, justifying it on the basis, well, the right to a safe environment requires these other rights to be curtailed.
Right. So this
and
is
in the context of ASEAN, sort of that question about ASEAN.
Right. So this is one of the developing areas. And by the way, this also connects with the earlier comment about the framework, how many states have signed on the framework principles from Sakam Pesh, or not, sorry, not Sakam, Nang Noi had asked that this is part of the area of discourse that's happening right now with the Special Rapporteur and the various discourses that connect with the Special Rapporteur and human rights and the environment, is that there's an interconnection between discussions and approaches to environmental conservation and discussions about human rights, but then also discussions about the political system, right? So that it's not just human rights, but human rights as in connection to the idea of democratization, devolution of authority, decentralization of authority, these kinds of things. Because the concern for those of you who in Asia, you know this quite well, that the law in Asia has historically been seen as an instrument of political agendas. So this is what we mean by the term rule by law, right? And so what's happened with the Human Rights Council is that there's an increasing amount of discussion that connects with the previous publications of the United Nations about rule of law. And hence the reason why in Asia, you see that there's been an increasing amount of development projects over the course of the past 20 or 30 years that regarding rule of law. And so this is trying to change the mindset of political leaders and political institutions in Asia, that law is not an instrument of political agenda, but that political agendas have to respect the law. So in order to do what you're mentioning, this is exactly the mindset or the motivation of the current discourses of the Special Rapporteur, is that we're trying to make it so that human rights and the environment can be respected, but not in service of politics, not in service of political power. Rather, it should be the other way around, that we are trying to promote human rights and environmental conservation to be above the interests of political power.
So So perhaps that also leads on to that question about the framework principles. You know, what's their status? Have they actually been adopted? Do they need to be adopted into national law? But also perhaps the follow-on question, which I think is quite interesting by Peter King, is talking about the emerging tendency to give ecosystems legal rights, whether they're rivers or, and some people call them legal personhood or human rights. But that question is, you know, is that likely to be a future trend of human rights in the environment, to give legal rights to natural ecosystems or identified areas?
Mm-hmm. So the first question, which is regarding the legal authority behind framework principles, is that they're not the same thing as a treaty, right? Excuse me. So, you know, treaties are binding upon state parties. Framework principles are exactly that, just principles. And in this case, because they're published by the Human Rights Council, they're meant to be principles that are to the states that are parties to the Human Rights Committee, and then by extension to the members of the United Nations General Assembly. However, being principles, that doesn't require that states adhere to them or states follow them, right? So this is that we say that they don't have the same kind of binding authority as states. So this is one of the challenges that we're dealing with right now. Regarding the second question about the rise of legal personality for nature. So a lot of this traces back to Christopher Stone, who is one of my professors, and you know, his seminal article, Do Trees Have Standing? And that this is, you know, that sort of fostered this movement. I mean, there were discussions about it, this going all the way back to the 1800s with John Muir, but now there's more impetus happening now. And you see a rising number of movements in different jurisdictions, so different countries, different states, about this idea of legal personality for nature. But as I alluded to earlier, you have to be careful. It depends on the state. So in India, for example, they had said that the Ganges River, the argument had been that the Ganges River has legal personality, and so therefore deserves or holds legal rights to defend itself. So the Indian Supreme Court, at least my understanding of the ruling that I read, the Indian Supreme Court said, yes, that it is possible for nature to have a legal personality and therefore to have legal rights. The problem is who shows up in court, right? What is the entity that walks into the courtroom to claim these rights? So, you know, and if you're going to say that there's a proxy, because in the law we can say that there is a representative by proxy, then who is the proxy? Who decides who the proxy is? And on that basis, the Indian Supreme Court said that you know, we can't make a ruling at this time, that these issues or these questions have to be addressed. In contrast, in Ecuador, you'll see that it's actually in the Constitution that they actually say that it's possible to have legal personality for nature within the Constitution. And then in New Zealand, I think most famously, you see that their courts have been much more progressive in saying that we recognize legal personality for rivers, for land trusts, and that we say that there is possible to identify a proxy to come to the court to administer the judgments, you know, those kinds of situations.
So there is a question by Tinte E about the right to a decent environment be a constitutional right, and I think you've alluded to that. I mean, and that issue about standing, I mean, the Philippine courts have identified future generations in opposa in factorum, or in terms of the cetaceans case, which was brought by Oceana on behalf of the whales and the dolphins, where the court has allowed someone to stand in as a proxy or as a representative. I mean, in some respect, law is always about people standing in either for their own rights or on behalf of someone else's. It's not an unusual concept to have a lawyer appear for a client or a lawyer appear for some class of people. So appearing for the environment seems a fairly logical progression in some respects. But coming back to that idea about you know, constitutional environmentalism, is that one way we integrate environmental rights more strongly. But in terms of human rights, someone always said you should never put, if human rights are indivisible, they don't need to be recognised in constitutions. They are.
Mm. So this is one of the things I've experienced going from the United States to Australia. And so in the United States, civil liberties are expressed in the Constitution. So First Amendment, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, et cetera, these kinds of things. So they're constitutionally present. In Australia, in contrast, they're not in a constitution that's comparable to the United States. It's something that's very much, the rights exist, but the rights exist effectively through legislation and court interpretation of common law principles related to those rights. Now, one of the things that's become very apparent, and this is what many legal scholars will always note, is that the advantage of having something in a constitution means that it's very difficult to deny them. It's very difficult to change them. It's very difficult to make an amendment to get rid of them. Whereas if you're in a country where rights only exist through laws or rights only exist through declarations of the court, then you are always at a danger of populist movements. So in other words, that you can have a new government in the parliament that will change the laws and remove rights or take them away. And if it's a common law situation, you'll have you will have some cases where they will rewrite the laws so that they're no longer a function of court decisions. And so this is always the danger that exists. And so to some degree, yeah, you would want rights contained in a constitution. However, once they're there, they're very difficult to change. So if you make a mistake, you're going to have to live with it. So this is one of the big challenges with that approach.
So, and look, in terms of timing, I think we're almost running up to the end, but there have been a number of questions in the Q&A about issues of non-compliance and breaches. If the government interprets their legal right over the environment as a blanket right to develop, how does communities or others take action? Or is that acceptable if the government decides that development over environment, development should always win? Is that justifiable depending on the constitutional requirements?
Yeah. So different jurisdictions have different approaches on this. So the example that I've always had to explain to people regarding the United States is that there's something called eminent domain. So I think there's a different term for it in Australia and United Kingdom and other countries like Singapore. But it's, this idea that the sovereign or the state, if there's some kind of need, can go ahead and take private property from the individual, but they can also take property from public lands like national parks, right? The issue, though, is that in the United States, they've created limits on eminent domain. They've created limits on the state in terms of what it can do in terms of seizing the environment or seizing property. And so this is where I think it becomes critical. And I'm not going to, again, I will not mention the countries in Asia by name, where I see some issues where they have articulated an idea of eminent domains. In other words, the ability of the states to take property for construction, for public service or public purposes, but they have not carried forward the attendant principle of limiting the state, right? That there has to be a limit on what the state can do. And in particular, that what's the impact on the environment, what's the impact on society, and so hence the reason why that there was a critical need for limits through environmental impact assessments, EIAs, social impact assessments, SIAs, and incidentally, this is where if something is in the Constitution, it would make a very powerful limit on states to engage in those kinds of actions.
So, Jonathan, can I Thank you very, very much indeed for your presentation. Can I thank all of our participants for attending and the questions. I'm sorry we haven't got to all the questions. They are exceptional, and it shows perhaps that this is really a very, very interesting topic, and one that perhaps there's a lot more opportunities to have discussions and debate. But would you like, in closing, just to say a few words?
Yeah. So thanks to everyone who attended today. I hope you found this useful. Admittedly, this is a very deep topic and a very complex one, and it's something that it's expanding all the time. So I did the best I could within the time limit that we had, and hopefully this provides you with an introduction to the issues, the concepts regarding the connection between human rights and the environment. One thing I will add is that there is a prevailing thinking of many environmental ministries in Asia that human rights is irrelevant to environmental conservation. And similarly, there is a mindset among many government officials that the environment has no connection to human rights. And I would stress that if you hear those kinds of debates or those discussions, you should point out to them the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment as evidence of a global movement to connect these two areas, and that they are interrelated and that they do need to be mindful of them. Now, the other thing I want to mention, I forgot to answer this question earlier, but I think it's very absolutely critical. There is a project that is happening. I'm involved with it, but there are other environmental lawyers and other environmental scholars like Matthew who are also involved, that we're saying that usually environmental conservation is done through litigation using environmental laws or environmental rights. But the implication that is happening now from the discussion today and from the Special Rapporteur and from the United Nations is that human rights provides another avenue or another strategy for action regarding the environment. And so that there needs to be some creative effort or energy by lawyers and legal scholars in different countries to explore how human rights and human rights law can be used to address environmental problems. And then likewise, how environmental laws and environmental conservation laws can be used to address human rights problems. And this requires a little bit of creativity. It requires a different change of approach. It requires expertise in both areas. But I would welcome those of you who are interested to join me, join Matthew, join others, because we would welcome your assistance in this area. All right, so thank you.
And thank you again very much, Jonathan. Thank you for all the questions, and we've seen some very interesting more questions come in, and I think we'll try and take some of those up. So this presentation and Jonathan's excellent PowerPoint, which also contains a number of links, will be put up to the teachenvironmentallaw.asia website. And again, this is part of an ongoing lecture series. So in 3 weeks, we will be having a discussion, a lecture by Paddy Moore, who will be talking about biodiversity within ASEAN. That again will be a free lecture, and we'll advertise it, and people are very welcome to come along. But again, can I virtually conduct some applause for Jonathan for your presentation today, and thank you very, very much for the thoughts and ideas. The last thing I would like to say on behalf of the Asian Development Bank Train the Teachers Environmental Law Program is we will still try and play the video again to see if we can show the work of the TTT, which is ongoing over the course of this year and is designed focused on environmental law academics, but also aspiring environmental law academics and students of environmental law. And so that teachenvironmentallaw.asia website contains links to a lot of material that is available on the teaching as well as the substance for environmental law. So with that, thank you again, Jonathan. Thank you for all our participants. It's been great to see you all on the Saturday morning across Asia. I think we've got someone from America, we've got Australia, we've got all the way to India. Thank you all very much. And I'll bring the session to a close and ask you all to return in 3 weeks' time for the same time for another excellent presentation, again by Paddy Moore on ASEAN biodiversity law. So thank you very much indeed, and have a safe weekend.